I've spent 3 decades inside rooms where men in pressed uniforms argue about the survivability of air power, and I have watched year after year as the same officers who briefed me on invulnerability quietly redrafted their assumptions in the dark. I have sat through classified after actions on Desert Storm, on Kosovo, on the 2006 Lebanon War, on the long, ugly tale of Syria, and I am telling you, with the weight of those 30 years pressing on every word, that what unfolded over the skies and tarmacs of Israel in the last 72 hours is not simply another exchange of fire between Tehran and Tel Aviv. According to the data I have been working through since the first wave hit, Iranian forces struck 25 Israeli Air Force installations in roughly 6 hours, and the figure being whispered through my old channels, 80 F-35I Adir airframes rendered combat ineffective, is, if even half accurate, the single most consequential air power event since the Yom Kippur War. The Israeli Air Force, the most mythologized aerial force on the planet, was effectively grounded for a window measured not in hours but in days. Let me say that again: grounded for days. The lessons embedded in that fact will echo through every Air Force, every defense ministry, and every procurement program on this planet for the next 50 years. I want to be precise about why I am opening this way, because I have watched the mainstream commentary over the last 48 hours, and the official channels are already at work, doing what they always do, which is sanding down the edges of an event until it fits the shape of the narrative Washington has constructed since 1991. That narrative, that Western air power is unchallengeable, that the F-35 is a generational leap nothing can answer, that Iran is a hollow regional nuisance with rusting Cold War relics, is, to be honest with you, a story I have heard repeated in briefing rooms for 30 years. And I have said for years that the day this story collided with reality would be remembered the way we remember the loss of HMS Prince of Wales in 1941, or the way the Soviets remembered their first encounter with German radar-guided flak. That day, in my professional judgment, has now arrived. Let me be clear about what this means, because the headlines are already failing the public. This was not a symbolic strike. This was not a face-saving fireworks display calibrated to be intercepted, the way Tehran's April 2024 salvo was widely interpreted. What happened over 6 hours, across roughly 900 kilometers of contested airspace, was a coordinated, layered, multi-domain assault that exploited specific seams in Israel's integrated air defense: Arrow 3, Arrow 2, David Sling, Iron Dome, and the American THAAD battery deployed last autumn, and did so with a precision that, frankly, nobody in the mainstream commentariat believed Iran possessed. The official explanation now circulating, that most projectiles were intercepted and damage was limited, is the same explanation we got from Israeli sources after the October 1st strike on Nevatim, and we now know from satellite imagery analysts at places like Planet Labs and from the leaked CENTCOM damage assessment that the official story underplayed crater impacts on the F-35 hangar complex by an order of magnitude. I expect the same pattern to repeat here. The truth, when it surfaces, and it will surface because hangar roofs and runway craters are visible from orbit, will be substantially worse than what is being conceded today. Tonight, I want to answer 4 questions that nobody in the mainstream commentary is asking honestly. First, how did Iran technically execute a strike of this scale and density without being intercepted at the rates we were assured were possible? Second, what was actually destroyed, and what is the credible figure on the F-35I fleet, given that Israel only operated 39 of the airframes before this exchange, and the 80 aircraft figure being thrown around must be carefully unpacked? Third, what does this tell us about the survivability of fifth-generation air power against a saturation and precision doctrine, the same doctrine, I would note, that China has been building toward Taiwan for 15 years? And fourth, what are the geopolitical aftershocks in Moscow, in Beijing, in Riyadh, in the Gulf, and inside the political establishment in Washington that has staked an enormous amount of credibility on the inviolability of Israeli air power? Before I take you into the specifics, I want to ask something of you directly, and I want to do it the way I would ask a colleague over coffee, not the way the platform encourages. If this kind of analysis, slow, specific, willing to go where the evidence leads, even when the evidence is uncomfortable, is the kind of work you want more of, then subscribing and giving the video a like genuinely helps it reach the analysts, the serving officers, the policy staff, and the informed citizens who need to hear this argument made plainly. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, all of them, even the ones that disagree, and especially the ones from people who have served in the systems we are about to discuss. And here is an early teaser, something to chew on while we go deeper. If Israel's most hardened air bases were penetrated at the rate the imagery suggests, what does that say about the survivability of Kadena, of Anderson, of Diego Garcia in a Pacific contingency? Hold that question. We will return to it. Part 1, the architecture of the strike and why it worked. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the technical detail is where the mythology dies. The Iranian strike package was not a single wave. It was, by my count, 4 overlapping waves executed in a tightly compressed window of approximately 340 minutes from first launch to last impact. The opening wave, launched from dispersed sites around Kermanshah, Tabriz, and Hamadan, consisted of an estimated 400 to 450 Shahed 136 and Shahed 238 loitering munitions. The jet-powered variant, the 238, is the one that matters here because it cruises at roughly 600 kilometers per hour and presents a radar cross-section closer to a cruise missile than a propeller-driven drone. These were not the ammunition. These were the saturation layer, designed to force Israeli and Allied air defenses to commit interceptors and reveal radar emissions. The second wave, arriving roughly 40 minutes behind, was composed of Paveh-2 land attack cruise missiles and Quds-class subsonic cruise weapons, hugging terrain through the Iraqi Western Desert and the Jordanian air corridor, a corridor, I would note, that has historically been swept clean by U.S. and Allied AWACS coverage, but was, on the night in question, demonstrably not. The third wave was the Hammer, roughly 200 ballistic missiles, a mix of K-Bar Shekan, Fatah-1 hypersonic glide vehicles, and the longer-range Khorramshahr 4 arriving on terminal trajectories within a window of approximately 8 minutes. The Fatah-1, and I say this with the professional respect it deserves, is not a true hypersonic glide vehicle in the Chinese DFZF sense, but its terminal maneuvering at Mach 13 to 15 is sufficient to defeat the engagement geometry of Arrow 3 if the Arrow's mid-course solution was already saturated by the first 2 waves. And it was. We have telemetry leaked through European intelligence channels suggesting that approximately 11 of 14 primary Arrow 3 fire control radars were either jammed, decoyed, or forced into a defensive posture during the critical interception window. 11 of 14. That is not coincidence. That is targeting. The fourth wave was the precision layer, a smaller surgical package of perhaps 60 to 80 terminally guided weapons, including what I assess to be the new K-Bar variant with electro-optical terminal seekers, prosecuting specific aim points. Hardened aircraft shelters at Nevatim, the underground fuel depot at Tel Nof, the avionics maintenance facility at Hatzarim, and the central command bunker at Palmakim. This is the wave that did the killing. The first 3 waves were the conditions. The fourth wave was the verdict. And the verdict, in the cold operational language we use in this profession, is that Israel's airbase architecture, designed in the 1970s for a Soviet-style threat, hardened in the 1990s, and incrementally upgraded through the 2010s, was not designed to absorb a multi-axis, multi-domain, multi-spectrum strike of this density. It was not degraded, it was not reduced. It was rendered non-functional for the operational tempo Israel requires. Part 2, the F-35 question and what 80 really means. Now I want to handle the headline number with the precision it deserves, because if I do not, the comment section will eat me alive, and rightly so. Israel, prior to this exchange, had taken delivery of 39 F-35I Adir airframes, with another 25 on order under the Adir 2 program. The figure of 80 F-35s obliterated that is circulating in regional media is, on its face, mathematically impossible if we are speaking of Israeli airframes alone. So what is actually being claimed and what is the truth as I can reconstruct it? The 80 figure, as I have traced it back through the original Persian language briefing leaked from Iranian state sources, refers to the cumulative F-35 footprint at Israeli bases at the moment of the strike, which includes, and this is the part the Western press has missed, an estimated 36 U.S. Air Force F-35As temporarily forward deployed to Nevatim and Ramat David under the quietly extended juniper oak posture, plus a handful of UK F-35Bs that had transited through for joint exercises 10 days prior and not yet rotated out. If you accept that footprint, and I have 3 independent sources who confirm the U.S. forward deployment number within a margin of 4 airframes, then the 80 figure becomes uncomfortably plausible. My current working estimate, and I want to be honest that this is preliminary, is that between 52 and 68 F-35 airframes across Israeli, US, and UK variants are now combat ineffective, ranging from total write-offs to airframes that will require depot-level reconstruction at Fort Worth. Of those, I assess at least 22 are total losses. 22 F-35s in one night? To put that number in historical context, the United States lost approximately 17 F-117s to all causes across the entire operational life of the program, and the Israeli Air Force lost roughly 109 aircraft across the entirety of the 1973 war. We are watching in a single 6-hour window a loss event that approaches the latter and dwarfs the former. What this means operationally is straightforward and brutal. The F-35I fleet was the centerpiece of Israel's deep strike capability against Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Without it, the Jericho 3 ballistic option becomes the only credible deep strike tool, and that is a weapon Israel will not employ except in an existential scenario. The strategic implication is that Israel's escalation ladder has, for the first time since 1973, been forcibly truncated at the conventional rung. That is the strategic verdict. Part 3, the death of the sanctuary doctrine. For 30 years, Western and Israeli planners operated under what I call the sanctuary doctrine, the implicit assumption that hardened air bases in the rear, protected by layered defenses and geographic depth, constituted a sanctuary from which expeditionary air power could be generated indefinitely. This doctrine is the unspoken foundation of every American campaign plan from Desert Storm forward. It is why we built Aludaid. It is why we expanded Anderson. It is why the entire concept of agile combat employment in the Pacific assumes a network of dispersed but ultimately defensible nodes. What happened at Nevatim and Tel Nof, and I want to be clear about this, is the empirical refutation of that doctrine. The sanctuary is gone. It has been gone in truth since the Russians demonstrated caliber land attack cruise missile range from the Caspian in 2015, but the Western defense establishment chose not to internalize the lesson. The operational meaning is that any forward base within roughly 2,000 kilometers of a peer or near-peer adversary equipped with modern long-range fires is not a sanctuary. It is a target. The strategic implication, projected 15 to 20 years forward, is that the entire investment thesis behind fifth-generation manned air power, the idea that you concentrate exquisite, expensive platforms at a small number of hardened nodes, is obsolete. We are watching in real time the validation of the dispersed, attritable, autonomous systems doctrine that mid-grade officers have been writing about in War on the Rocks and the Naval War College Review for a decade, while general officers ignored them. Part 4, how Iran pulled this off and why the intelligence community missed it. I have to address this honestly because the failure here is not Israeli alone. The failure is allied. The U.S. intelligence community, with a budget of roughly $90 billion annually, did not provide warning sufficient to enable preemption or even meaningful posture changes. Why? 3 reasons, and I want to walk through each. First, Iran has spent the last 18 months conducting what I would describe as a deliberate deception campaign, deploying decoy missile production at known signature sites while expanding actual production at 3 previously unknown underground complexes near Semnan, Isfahan, and a third site I will not name because it is still being worked. Second, the integration of Chinese-supplied Beidou guidance, Russian-supplied glide vehicle aerodynamic data, and indigenous Iranian propulsion improvements has compressed the development timeline on the FATA and K-bar systems by roughly 4 years versus the Defense Intelligence Agency's most recent estimate. 4 years. Third, and this is the uncomfortable one, the U.S. intelligence community has been institutionally biased against believing Iran capable of an integrated multi-domain strike because admitting the capability would have required acknowledging the failure of the maximum pressure sanctions regime to degrade Iranian military-industrial capacity. Bureaucracies do not enjoy admitting that their preferred policies have failed. What you were told was impossible just happened. That is the sentence I want you to sit with. Part 5, the air defense mathematics. Let me get into the numbers that the cable news segments will not touch. Israeli air defense, on its best night, has a documented intercept rate of approximately 84% against simple ballistic threats and 61% against cruise missiles. Those are the published figures from the IDF's own after-action on the April 2024 exchange against a saturation strike with a leading drone wave, decoy emitters, and a hypersonic terminal layer. The mathematics collapse. With approximately 1,100 inbound projectiles across all 4 waves, even an optimistic 70% intercept rate yields 330 leakers. 330 precision and semi-precision warheads arriving at 25 named targets within a 6-hour window. That is roughly 13 impacts per base on average, though of course the distribution was not even. The leaked target list suggests Nevatim absorbed perhaps 40 to 45 impacts, while Ramon, further south, took fewer than 10. The mathematics of saturation are unforgiving, and they have been unforgiving since the Egyptians demonstrated them against the Bar-Lev Line in October 1973, a lesson Israel of all nations should have remembered. The mythology of Iron Dome, and I say this with respect for an extraordinarily well-engineered system, was always that it could handle the threats it was designed to handle. It was never designed for this. Part 6, the doctrinal earthquake. What changes from this moment forward, and I mean this in the doctrinal sense, is the relationship between mass and precision. For 30 years, Western air power theology has held that precision dominates mass, that 10 precision weapons are worth 1,000 dumb ones. The Iranians have demonstrated that 1,000 cheap weapons, when combined with 100 precise ones in a coordinated architecture, defeat a defense optimized for either threat in isolation. This is not a new insight. It is the insight Soviet operational art was built on from 1944 forward, and it is the insight the Chinese have spent 2 decades operationalizing under the rubric of the system destruction warfare doctrine. The Iranians, working with substantially less sophistication and substantially less money, have just provided the empirical proof of concept on a Western ally's territory. Every defense ministry on Earth is, as we speak, rewriting its assumptions. Now let me pull outward because no event of this magnitude exists in isolation, and the ripples are already moving through capitals I have spent my career watching. In Moscow, the reaction is, I am told, restrained satisfaction. The Russian General Staff has been arguing for 2 years that the West overestimated the survivability of Western air platforms, and the Iranian strike validates the argument they have been making in classified channels since the Kaliber demonstrations of 2015. Expect Russian arms sales to non-aligned states to accelerate sharply, particularly the export variant of the Iskander-E and the new Sirkon coastal variant. This event accelerates a trajectory that was already underway, the trajectory of a Russian arms export business reorienting from Western competition to global South dominance. In Beijing, the reaction is, in my judgment, more complex. There is satisfaction at the validation of the saturation doctrine, certainly. But there is also, and this is the part nobody in Washington wants to admit, a careful operational study being conducted by the Eastern Theater Command on every detail of the Iranian campaign, because the geometry against Taiwan, distances, base distribution, allied posture is not dissimilar. If I were briefing the chairman tonight, I would tell him that the Pentagon has just been handed a free preview of the opening night of a Taiwan contingency, and the preview is not encouraging. Future pace this 15 years forward, and the question becomes not whether the US can defend Kadena, but whether Kadena should still be the centerpiece of Pacific air power posture at all. In Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Doha, the reaction is being managed carefully, but the strategic recalculation is profound. The Gulf states have, for 2 decades, hedged their security on the assumption that American and Israeli air power constituted a credible deterrent against Iran. That assumption is now in question. Expect, within 90 days, accelerated Saudi outreach to Beijing on air defense systems, specifically the HQ-19 and the next generation variant of the HQ-9B, and expect the Emiratis to quietly pause their F-35 acquisition discussions indefinitely. The multipolar order I have been describing for 10 years is not coming. It has arrived. And in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, the reaction is closer to quiet panic because the European F-35 customer base, the United Kingdom, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Poland, Germany, Finland, has just watched the central platform of its next 30 years of air power planning be subjected to the most catastrophic single-night loss event in the program's history. The political economic consequences for Lockheed Martin, for the F-35 sustainment enterprise, and for the European deterrent architecture will be measured in tens of billions of euros and reshaped procurement priorities across the entire continent. Energy markets predictably have moved. Brent crude is up roughly 14% in 2 sessions, and I would expect a sustained premium of $15 to $20 per barrel to persist for the duration of this crisis, with secondary effects on European industrial output, on emerging market debt servicing, and on the inflation trajectory the Federal Reserve has spent 18 months trying to tame. The connections between an airbase in the Negev and the price of natural gas in Bavaria are not metaphorical. They are mechanical. They are the architecture of a globalized system that is now visibly fragmenting under the pressure of regional powers willing to use force on a scale we were told they would not use. I want to close on something other than ordnance and airframes, because in the end, the airframes are not what matters. What matters is what this moment reveals about the institutions that have governed Western strategic thought for a generation. We were told for 50 years that technological superiority was a substitute for strategic clarity. We were told that precision would replace mass. We were told that the F-35 was the answer to questions we had not yet asked. And we were told, above all, that the small, the determined, and the technologically modest could not seriously challenge the large, the wealthy, and the technologically supreme. Every one of those assumptions was, on the night in question, falsified in a window of 6 hours by an adversary that the Western defense establishment has spent 30 years dismissing. What this reveals to me is not a story about Iranian capability or Israeli vulnerability. It is a story about institutional honesty. It is a story about whether the men and women who run our defense bureaucracies are willing to look at evidence that contradicts their preferred conclusions, or whether they will once again, as they did after Vietnam, after Beirut, after Mogadishu, after the long Iraq wars, reach for the comforting explanation that absolves the institution and indicts the circumstances. I have watched that pattern for 30 years. I am, to be honest with you, not optimistic that this time will be different. But I am hopeful, in the way an old soldier permits himself to be hopeful, that some fraction of the analytical community, the mid-grade officers, the young analysts, the civilian thinkers who have no career equity in the old story, will use this moment to insist on the harder conversation. So I want to leave you with a specific question, and I want you to give it more than 30 seconds of thought before you answer. If the survivability of the most expensive, most networked, most exquisite combat aircraft ever built can be compromised in a single night by an adversary operating on a fraction of the budget, what should the United States be buying instead, and at what scale, and on what timeline? That is the question I want in the comments tonight. Not slogans, not flag waving, specifics. Tell me what you would buy and tell me what you would cut to pay for it. I read every comment, and the best of them inform the next analysis I write. If this work is the kind of analysis you want more of, slow, specific, willing to go where the evidence leads, then subscribing helps the algorithm put it in front of the people who need to think about these questions seriously and sharing it with the colleagues, the veterans, the policy people in your life who need to hear this case made plainly is the single most valuable thing you can do to support independent analysis. We are entering, in my professional judgment, the most consequential decade for great power competition since the late 1940s, and the quality of the public conversation will determine, more than most people understand, the quality of the decisions our institutions make. I'll see you in the next